What's a random fact about yourself?
Random fact, my first name isn't Steve, it's actually Alvaro. I'm Alvaro, and this is my story.
Go ahead and tell us about your story.
Okay, so I was actually born in Los Angeles, California. I lived there until I was 15 years old. During those 15 years, my family was actually really involved with church because my mom, she was involved with the music team and she did a ton of other things too. So for those 15 years, we were going to church almost every single Sunday. And it's because of these 15 years that I was aware of who God was. I learned that He existed, that we've been created by Him, and that He loved us. But anyways, when I turned 15, around that time, my mom was kind of struggling with whether to move to Nebraska or not. And eventually she made the decision to finally move to Nebraska. And I remember my siblings were, obviously upset. We were leaving our friends and everything that we'd known. And I remember during that time also asking God why He was moving us away. It seemed really unfair. It didn't make sense to me, but we made the move. And so we moved to Wakefield, Nebraska, which is a town about 10 miles northeast of Wayne. And for the first few weeks at Wakefield, Nebraska, I didn't enjoy my time. I remember every night before going to bed telling my mom that I wanted to move away. But we didn't, we stayed. And eventually I started doing sports. And it was because of sports that I met a lot of people. And eventually I became cool enough and I got invited to a movie night. And it was actually at this movie night where I was invited to church. And it was actually Calvary Bible, where the church that I was invited to. And it was through the church that I started going through the youth group, and eventually the youth group went through a book called Crazy Love by Francis Chan. And in this book, there's a chapter that describes lukewarm Christianity. And it basically tells you what the Bible says about lukewarm Christianity and what Jesus says about it. And it's basically a Christian who isn't all in for Jesus, but at the same time isn't all out and is kind of in between about Jesus and is sitting on the fence. And this book says that the Bible says that if anyone is in between, that Jesus will spit you out. And so I remember reading that chapter and knowing that I wasn't all in for Jesus because of the life that I was living. And so after reading this chapter, I remember I responded in a really, really bad way. It's actually a good chapter. I remember I said, okay, if God is going to spit me out if I'm in between, I'm going to do everything in my power to make myself hot for Him. I'm going to go all in for Him so that when He comes back, or if I die, He's going to have to receive me. And so I went on to live my high school life in a really legalistic way. I remember thinking, if I do only good things and I avoid the bad things, then God will have to accept me when He comes back. And so I lived that way. Now when I look back, I was never at peace where I was. I never knew where I stood with God. And so that was my high school life. Eventually college was around the corner and I ended up going to Wayne State because it was my only option because I procrastinated. I wasn't thinking about college, so I decided to go to Wayne State. And I remember when I was in high school, people would always tell me if I would decide to go to Wayne to try the crew ministry that was there because it was like a college version of a youth group. And so I decided to go, and it was at the first crew meeting that I met someone named Nelson, and he became a dear friend of mine. But during that, when I first met him, he invited me to a baptism that his church was holding. And at this baptism, which was on a Saturday, before the baptism started, which was at a lake, there was going to be a presentation of the gospel. The pastor of the church was just supposed to preach on the gospel and what it meant. I went and I heard the message, and he started off with who God was and how He was holy and how He was righteous and how He loved purity and how He was light and how this was a huge problem because we're everything that God isn't. We're dark, we're sinful, we love our sin, and this is a huge problem because God, when He created us, intended us to be in fellowship with Him, but God can't dwell with that. And because God is just, He has to punish that, and He can't fellowship with it. So I remember all of that making sense and seeing how there's this big gap between me and God. So after He talked about who we were and who God was, He went on to describe what people usually do when they see this gap. Usually they try to close the gap by themselves with their own power. They try to do enough good and not a lot of bad so that hopefully when God comes back, He accepts them. But he went on to quote scripture, actually the Apostle Paul. He says that like our good works were never meant to make us righteous, how the law was never put in place so that we would become righteous by, but it was meant to show us how much we fell short. And so he was quoting all these things, and he exposed the very thing that I was doing in high school, where I was trying to basically close the gap between me and God on my own strength. And so all of it was convicting, and it all made sense. I knew that I wasn't following Jesus. I knew that I was guilty, that God wouldn't fellowship with me because of everything. But then he went on to say, God makes a way for the gap to close between us. And so he sends Jesus, his son, so that Jesus would hang on the cross for my sins. He hung on the cross as if he committed the sin. He absorbs the wrath of God, the righteous wrath of God, so there's none left for me when I trust in him. And so now there's peace with me and God. But not only that, but I also learned that God offers his righteousness as a gift. He offers the life that Jesus lived. I get all the rewards from that when I trust in him as if I had lived the life that Christ lived. So he gives me his forgiveness and his righteousness as a gift. And for me to listen to all of this, that God does all of that, just for me became really good news and understood why it was really, really good news. It was in that moment where the gospel made sense to me. And I remember thinking, like, God, if this is true, I want to follow you because I'm becoming aware that I can't save myself, that I can't close this gap that exists between me and you. But you've also made a way for me to fellowship with you, something that you created me to do. And so I remember that day deciding to rededicate my life or give my life to Christ. I don't know which one it was, but that day I wanted to follow him, and I actually got baptized that same day. And so when I look back to my life when I struggled with being a lukewarm Christian, I see that one of the cures to not being a lukewarm Christian is actually knowing what the gospel is. Knowing that God has given everything for you that he's given in his son actually encourages you to go all in for Jesus. It actually makes you on fire for him, and so it cures that lukewarmness that we may struggle with. Also too, even as I step back even more, it's so cool to see that God kind of answered my question that I asked him when I was moving to Nebraska as to why he was moving us. Because now that I step back and I see these 7 years that I've been in Nebraska, I can see why he wanted to move me here. Because it was here in Nebraska where God grabbed a hold of my heart, where he used people that loved him. He used his word and the preaching of his word to basically grab a hold of my heart, to show me what the gospel meant, that really the gospel is good news, that God has done something in history. And I love actually one of the quotes that my favorite preachers always says, that the gospel isn't primarily good advice on how life should be lived, but it's actually good news about God doing something in history that changes everything. And so it's God closing the gap between us. It's God entering our space and saving us when we couldn't, when we were actually running away from him. And so all of that has been amazing.
This is the story of how Jesus has changed my life.
Has he changed yours?
Oh, what's one random fact that you'd like people to know about yourself?
I don't know if I want people to know, but I mean, I hum when I eat.
You've never led worship in a bathroom?
I've played guitar, in the Nightheart men's restroom, for Ross when he was in there. At Parker, that's it, but...
What is the context of that?
We were in Nightheart, they were showering, I wasn't, and I grabbed my guitar and went in there. Yeah, I do that for Travis sometimes, too, when he's showering in the apartment. Yeah. Yeah.